What is going on, comic fam? It's your boy, the bearded comic bro, and I am joined by comic creator Dan Chichester. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, thank you. I'm really happy to be here. It's great to start the year off. My first podcast of the year. So
And
thank you.
this is my first podcast of the year as well.
Oh
So
my
look,
God!
it's meant to be.
Exactly.
It's cool to I always like to have these conversations, and we were talking via email. We got to connect briefly at GalaxyCon here in Columbus back in
Hmm.
December, and that was a blast. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a nice convention. Yeah, it
it
was fun.
It really was. And you've been involved in comics for quite a while with your runs on Daredevil and Nick Fury Agents of Shield, and you've done some
Hmm.
stuff with now with Daredevil Black Armor, and
Yep.
the list goes on and on. And I want to hop into all of those things. But before we do, did you always grow up liking comics, or was this kind of something that came on later in life for you?
No, I was a big comics fan as a kid. I had an older cousin who I idolized a little bit, and to get rid of me, he gave me big bucket of comics, not a box of comics, a bucket, literally of comics, a barrel actually, a big barrel of comics, and just to try to get rid of me. And I think that's what really got me
Yeah.
hooked and interested. And then I started to kind of do the long ride across too much traffic, the corner store that's sort of a newsstand that sold them, and I read them voraciously, really. Like I was this closet comics fan. I wasn't keeping it from anybody, but I didn't really know anybody to share it with. Nobody
Right.
else ever really seemed to be reading comics, or I later found out one of my good friends also liked comics, but we never talked about it. But I was mostly DC's, now and again a Marvel, oddly enough, mostly because of the initials. It's probably DC. That sounds good. Yeah,
Yeah.
DC.
I wonder
Um,
why those
I
initials
wonder
sounded good to
why.
me.
Sound, I don't understand. And but then I stopped. It's weird. I just stopped reading comics and buying comics probably when I was around, I want to say, like, I feel like about the time I went to high school, and not consciously. It wasn't like, oh, I don't want to be perceived differently or something. It's just something like the switch just went off.
Yeah.
And then when I would get the job at Marvel that I got when I was finishing up my college run toward the end of my uh, junior year, that's when I kind of got back into it, and that was sort of my entry point. My entry point was really around um, that I knew all the characters, like the osmosis effect, worked. Even though I hadn't picked up a comic in a bunch of
Right.
years. I'd walk through Forbidden Planet, which is a big store in New York. When I was in college, it was in the Village in New York, and but I didn't really go to the comic section. I was more interested in the pop culture and the science fiction, but still I could immediately go right back in. Who's Cap?
Yep.
Who's the Hulk? Who's Spider-Man? It's all right there.
So, you said you grew up DC fan.
Yeah.
Mostly were there creators that like you gravitated towards, or was it just characters more for you as a kid?
I think, like probably a lot of people, I gravitated towards creators and characters, creators in some ways more without even knowing who they were
Yeah.
immediately. Like and I remember very distinctly, Mike Grell was an artist and a writer who every time I'd see his stuff, I'd pick it up. Jim Aparo was another one, the angular lines and that sort of thing. And then I would later kind of fall in love with Steve Englehart's work. And then, he's one of the first writers I really remember loving on his Batman run. And then Danny O'Neill, of course.
Yep.
These are kind of the people that started to connect with me. And then the characters they were associated with would be the things I would follow more because I'd love Jim Aparo's style. And it's like, oh, this week he's doing a Joker story. Next week he's doing a Phantom Stranger story, and then I'd move around and start to explore the characters more. And I definitely probably liked the Phantom Stranger was probably my favorite character, even though there, to this day I still don't know what the hell he is or was or anything. But I just love that idea, that this dude in a hat and weird eyes and a cape and going around saying sort of Rod Serling, Twilight Zoney things resonated with me.
Is it weird, like when you got into the industry and you started to, you now started to become peers with some, because you mentioned Mike Grail, who was at GalaxyCon a couple years ago, and I know Steve Englehart
Hmm.
was just, I think you were even on a panel with Steve.
Steve Englehart was sitting right next to
Yeah,
me.
like we're at that point where like these were some of these creators like that you grew up reading that you're like, oh, I'm a peer with them now. Like, did you ever have like that moment of like, wow, this is kind of cool?
Yeah, in a lot of ways. I mean, Steve Englehart, I really geeked out on at the convention. I was like, I got to say, you were a dude. I read your stories, and they meant a
Mhm.
lot to me. And we ended up hanging out a little bit and having a nice conversation, and I appreciated that opportunity. But a lot of them, I came to meet when I was an editor. I was an
Okay.
assistant editor, and I was an editor. So meeting them in that situation was really good for me, I think, even more than meeting them as a writer, because I got to understand their working process a
Mhm.
little bit more. I got to sort of see what made them tick, and try to give them some respect, and help them tell the stories that they were looking to tell, whether they were an artist or a writer, and how could I help guide that story or make that story happen, and in the process also learn, how did you do it?
Yeah.
I edited a book at Epic Comics, where I worked at Marvel, called Martial Law, and Pat Mills was the writer, and Kevin O'Neill was the artist, and Pat Mills was this British writer who was just so brilliant. I'd look at the scripts and wonder, did he ever make a mistake? And how did he get his language so precise? And how did he do the things he did? And it was great to be able to learn from guys like him. And most of them were really genuine human beings. So
Yes.
you pretty quickly got over oh my God, you're Tom Palmer. Oh my God, you're Bill Sienkiewicz. And you just kind of operate it with them on a good professional level. Or in some cases, I was lucky enough to become really good friends with some of them. And Bill Sienkiewicz is one of my dearest friends to this day. So I was very lucky in those regards.
So you mentioned that kind of got back in the comics when you got connected with Marvel,
Hmm.
and in college. Where was that? Where did that kind of turn happen? How did you get connected with Marvel?
Well, I went to film school, which was a very expensive proposition, and burned through my parents' money, burned through my money, and kind of got to the end of the bank account while I was still in school, and so went to the student employment office, and they had odd jobs around the city or whatever, but there's a little card there. This is old analog days, and it's typist at Marvel Comics. So I'm in the film program, I'm in the screenwriting program, and saying to myself, well, I'm a really good typist, and if you're going to type somewhere, Marvel Comics sounds pretty cool, and my head was going back to those characters,
Right.
so I headed up there, and they had just somebody else had just given away the job that I'd come in to interview for. But the people who I was supposed to interview with talked to me for a few minutes and said, "Well, you're not drooling. You seem like you have a head on your shoulders." Lynn Cohen, who is Jim Shooter being the editor in chief at that time, Lynn is his assistant. She needs an assistant. Do you want to go talk to her? So this was then the assistant to the assistant to the editor in chief. And Lynn probably would have taken anybody who didn't drool at that point. But I made a good enough impression that she grabbed me up. And even though I was still in school and I could only do the job part time, um, to me, it was like, it was great. It was a creative environment. It was a fun environment. It was a quirky place. I mean, I was nervous as all get out. It being, I mean, I'm at Marvel Comics. What happens
Right.
if Stan Lee comes down the hall, and there's that guy there? That's Chris Claremont, isn't he? And there was that sort of,
Yeah.
again, suddenly those associations of all these names and people are real, like they're real personalities. And but there were some really just great friendly people who said hello right away and helped me overcome that nervousness. But the entree point, and then I quit. I quit at the end of the semester, which they were all shocked by because nobody gets the job and quits. And but as I was, but I was going home for the summer, and I had a job lined up for the summer, and it paid quite a bit more actually than the Marvel job did. And but then they called me over the summer and said, "Hey, do you want to come back in the fall as an assistant editor at Epic?" And I had the same caveats. I said, "Well, I'm still in school. I can only do it part time, and I'd be happy to come up after my classes and do that. And if you're willing to work around that schedule." I was planning on like going to Hollywood, right? This was
Right.
my end game. Like I'm going to graduate, everyone's going to realize my genius. I'm going to go right to the West Coast. But I figured, there's a practical value to sort of having a job lined up for graduation. And so I took the part-time job, which then became full-time after I graduated. And then, 13, 15 years later, it was a career.
You're like, I guess I'll deal with the Marvel for a little bit so I get to Hollywood.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly.
So, your journey a little bit of assistant to assistant to assistant to assistant editor, now to, I got familiar with your work as a writer. Where
Hmm.
was that process for you? I know you said you would, were working on screenplays and stuff like that, for
Right,
film school and
right.
things. Where was that transition then in that time from assistant editor to say, hey, I want to, work on my chops here a little bit of, I've got some writing.
Well, that was always the game, right?
Yeah.
Hey, I'm a writer, I'm a writer, and that I want to be recognized as that. And yes, thinking, okay, my ultimate deal will be in Hollywood or something like that. But in the meantime, here's a medium where I could get my name in some credit boxes. But everybody else wants to do the same thing. Um, and then the lead was not only the credit and the appeal of working maybe with some characters, but also the fact I was paid nothing. So you're looking for a bit of a side hustle before that was a term, but I was struggling against massive insecurity, right? Both the hubris of being I'm going to conquer the world and this massive insecurity. So it was very
Yeah.
hard for me to kind of pitch a story. But a woman who would become a friend, Margaret Clark, um, was much more secure than I was, also wanted to write, but she wasn't getting any traction because, frankly, she was a woman, and there was more than a bit of that
Yeah.
going on. Um, but we sort of thought maybe we could actually help each other out here. We were simpatico in terms of like story sense, but we thought, hey, if we go in as a team, um, she could help me overcome my insecurities, and because I was a guy, people would pay more attention to her. Stupid, but it kind of worked, and we
Yeah.
started to kind of pitch things and not sell anything of note right away, but you'd sell inventory stories. You'd sell inventory stories to Thundercats or Defenders of the Earth, which was another cartoon property. Like a lot of stories that editors would buy, never with any intention to run the story. They would get done. They'd go in the art file just in case the regular team fell off schedule, and then they might run the story to get themselves back on schedule. But that was good experience because you'd get some feedback from a decent editor and say, well, this isn't that great, but if you did this, it will be a little bit better. And that was a great place to learn, instead of being thrown right into the deep end. Not that anyone was going to give us the deep end. No one's handing us like a Captain America story. We're doing a Thundercat story, but you learn a lot
Yeah.
by working with licensed characters because they have identities and they have personalities and they have rules.
Yeah.
And when you do commercial style writing, working with things that have a life before you get there and that they're going to have a life after you leave, it's good to learn the rules.
And you've done, obviously with stuff like now you're working with, you had worked with Daredevil and things, and
Hmm.
you even had licensed property. I remember we were talking at GalaxyCon, you had one of book I read as a kid, you had the first issue of Sequest. Like,
Yeah, yeah, it's exactly right. It tells you the Sequest story, right? Yes.
so like you've dealt with these, with these properties and things like this. And so let's talk about one of the runs that I got familiar with, and I think people are coming back to a little bit more now, obviously, because in circulation is your Daredevil run. So
Sure.
you were on Daredevil for quite a while, and that
Yep.
was I believe it was it the Fall from Grace where the black armor kind of got introduced into that run.
Yes. Yes. I mean, when I started the first kind of prestige-ish thing that, I had been involved with was what we called Last Rites or the Fall of the Kingpin, where we took the Kingpin down.
Mhm.
And then a couple years after that, working with Scott McDaniel, we had done this big Fall from Grace story. So all this nonsense goes on, and oh my gosh, terrible threats in New York City. And Matt Murdock, Daredevil, decides he needs not Iron Man level armor, but he needs a little bit more protection than the red jammies. So, so that's where that costume came out of, and it's funny until recently I would never call it armor, in fact, the if you've read the comic, it's
Yep.
the line of like, I never called it that is essentially my line, but that's where it came out of, and Scott did a great job. Scott McDaniel did a great job, I thought, designing it, and it had verve, and it sort of fit the style of the day, but also wasn't over manufactured like some of those costumes were. It was sort of just enough, but it suffered from the fact that very few people except Scott could draw it well,
Mhm.
and a lot of people would just see armor, and then they would do bolts and bulkiness, and kind of ruin the feel of it.
Right.
And there were a lot of this is obviously pre-internet, but a lot of people really tested out their troll souls by slamming it. They were very vocal about how much they did not like the idea of Daredevil changing his costume. And so we ate a lot of fecal matter for that.
So the overall reception, people, because I obviously didn't read it till later, so I didn't get that. The
Sure.
reception wasn't they didn't love it, is what you're saying, or was it just a select
Well,
group that were
there were
like,
there was there were people who liked the story. The story had some
yeah,
good energy to it. And nowadays, now I'm meeting a lot of people who they were excited by that story when they read it, and now they're
mhm,
older and more adult, and they're still excited about it.
right,
And I think a lot of those people are also excited about seeing the costume back in play. But we didn't get uh, uh, massive damage. It wasn't like everybody hated the costume, but there was certainly a vocal set that clearly did not like it. And one of those sets would ultimately be somebody in the editorial staff, because after I left, after I was removed from the book and the book shifted editorial offices, they couldn't destroy that costume fast enough. So um but it was the right thing at the right time. It
yeah,
was part of a gimmick to also drive sales on the book. We were doing big events, and we were doing guest stars, and you change the costume on something when you want to generate sales. And when you're doing a commercial book, you're trying to sell it. You're
yeah.
trying to get more readers. You're not doing a precious little story that nobody reads. And so we wanted to do big things like that, but also make them make sense for the character and make sense for the world.
Yeah, there's a reason behind the change, whether
Yeah,
people like it or not. You have a plan. You're not just doing it to do it. You're saying, hey, look,
exactly.
we want to
Exactly.
have bigger, we want to have, he's facing bigger threats, like, and
Yeah,
I've
totally.
never heard it referred to as jammies, but I love it now, and I'm only going to be able to picture it now as I'm like,
Sorry. And I love the red costume. Don't
yeah.
get me wrong. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but
But I think you're seeing elements of it, like you said. My store owner, when I saw, this list is for your Daredevil Black Armor now, that's currently out. I was like, oh my goodness, this is fantastic. Like, I'm so glad they're going back into this realm. And he's like, I am too. Like, the store owner is like, he's like, this is one of He was like, I love this one. So like I think there were a lot of us that did, you know, gravitate towards it. And if you look at, even now like current Daredevil stuff, and they're portraying it with like he's a little bit more of armor-esque material, even like
Oh,
in TV
sure,
shows and stuff
sure.
now. So
I
like,
think, he showed up in the TV series even,
yeah,
as well, going to Melvin Potter, and
yep,
sort of saying, "Hey, you made this for the Kingpin, make me something a little bit more." It was not that costume, clearly,
right,
but it was a little bit more protective than you just slipping on a red suit, and
right.
running out there. So,
So where was this then of, like I said, currently as we're talking, I think issue two is and I know issue two's out, I have it right here. Issue three's about to come out soon.
yeah, a couple weeks.
So where was this of like, how did you get approached, or did you approach Marvel to say like, hey, is this something we can dig back into, or how did this come about?
No, Greg. I mean, I mean, my most diplomatic way of putting my end on Daredevil was, I was inelegantly removed from the book, right?
Mhm.
So, but but I never sort of stood around for the last 20 odd years,
Right.
25 odd years, saying, you know what, I mean, I did do one other Daredevil story, where Tim Toohey had asked me and Lee Weeks to come back and do this 380, which was sort of like the last of the run before it went back to number one with Kevin Smith
Mm.
and Joe
Yeah.
Quesada and Jimmy Palmiotti, which was nice. But I never sat around saying, "Hey, I've got another Daredevil
Right.
story," or "I wish I could have," or whatever. It was the day was done, and I'd moved on and done other things. And in fact, really had not worked in comics, for quite some time, because I was working in advertising. I'm still working in advertising, but I was at a convention. It was a terrific con, which is a great show in
It is.
Connecticut, a lot of fun, and and this dude comes up to me and he's, very friendly, and he's like, "Oh, you're DG, it's really loved your stuff, I'm CB Sobolski." And I'm really slow, I'm not too quick on the uptake. So I'm like, "Damn, that name sounds familiar." Oh, you're the editor in chief of Marvel Comics, and so, he's really friendly, and we're chatting for a couple minutes, and I jokingly just said, "Hey, I've been meaning to send you those proposals I've been working on," and he just goes, "As a matter of fact," and he's the one who introduced it, and he just introduced the idea that, they'd been doing what he called these nostalgia comics, where they've been getting mostly writers, I think, to kind of
Mm.
come back on properties, that they had worked on back in the day, and they'd had some success with them. And would I be interested in something? Now, we didn't talk about what at the time, but put two and two together, and it's probably not going to be one of my more fringe properties. It's probably going to be Daredevil, which I'm maybe more well known for. And but I wasn't sure he was going to follow up on it. But I followed up with him. He gave me his email addresses, and he immediately had put me in touch with Devin Lewis, who's the editor on Daredevil. And Devin, the minute I reached out to him, I was reaching out to him to introduce myself, and he had jumped in front of the line. And so we chatted for 2 seconds, and then the first thing he was like, well, yeah, we were thinking we'd like to do something back in the 90s, the Marvel 90s, whatever, but we want to do it with the black armor costume. And I burst out laughing, for all the reasons you and I have just been talking about. I
Right.
said, you have no idea the amount of crap, me and Scott ate for that costume, and you guys want to bring it back, But I think, there's just a lot of, there's a nostalgia factor. There's people who grew up with it and thought it was cool when they were younger. There was an awesome toy that Hasbro did. I think there's just a sense of, style to it that a lot of people saw something in, and I think we've realized a lot of great things with it. And I was really lucky. We teamed up with Netho Diaz, who's the artist, and this guy has, owned it. He has
Yeah.
made it his own. He's done it totally different than Scott ever did it, but he's brought the vibe of that era, the vibe of that costume, and I couldn't be more excited than, than I am to have been part of this. And and to play with this in this way, it's just been a blast. It's been a rush.
Well, and it's probably been nice. I know you've been to a couple cons probably since this has come out,
Yeah.
and you're probably starting to hear a little bit of the nostalgia of like myself and other people who are like, this is
Hmm.
something that we really did appreciate and we really did, enjoy reading. And so it's kind of got to be a little nice to have that, like you said, with some of the other stuff we've talked about of where you heard some of the other voices.
Yeah, and those are a ways back again.
Yeah.
That was that, and there was always that chance. I mean, the best headline when the news broke that this was coming out, because obviously we've been working on it for a while before the news even came out. At the beginning of the summer, I think it was that they finally blabbed at San Diego Con at a behind closed doors retailer thing. Like, closed doors with all the retailers with their phones, taking pictures of the PowerPoint presentation. Um, but there was one great headline where it was worst writer returns with worst costume ever, which was just, that's the level set, you want
Wow.
that puts your ego right where it
Yeah.
needs to be. But everybody else, honest to God, has just been very supportive, very
Yeah.
interested. And I would think if people really hated this costume and really hated what we were doing with it, man, we would hear about it, right?
Yeah.
I would be crawling
Yep.
into a hole from savagery on whatever, Twitter, Instagram, pick your social cesspool of choice.
Right.
And 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 in and you're obviously probably buffered a little bit by the people who like what you're doing, and they're being positive about it, and they're interacting with you in a positive way. But if there were people who really didn't like it, I'm pretty sure I'd hear a lot more of that as well.
Yeah.
So I think there's a sense of good energy. People have gotten the sense that we are doing a justice to the character.
Mhm.
I think we've surprised some people. There was one review which I really enjoyed, where and the guy sort of set it up with like how much he was prepared to hate this.
Mm.
He really didn't like my work in the day. He really didn't like the costume. He really didn't like the era. I mean, he was being fair.
Yeah.
He was saying it like in a kind of a like this is the facts, sort of way. And then he just shifted gears and he says, and I can't stop smiling as I'm reading this, like in spite of myself. And he just appreciated that we were taking it seriously and we were trying to do good things and did do good things with it. And Netho is as I said, I think is a phenomenal talent, and I know I'm much better writer than I was. So it's a little easier that way.
How was it then to get back into, because like you said, you weren't sitting around going, oh, I got a Daredevil story I have to tell.
Right.
So like when this kind of idea came to fruition of like, oh, I'm going to be doing, this
Yeah.
Daredevil arc, how did you decide, where you were going to set it, how you were going to bring it
Hmm.
back in? What was that process like for you?
I had on and off, I had read Daredevil over the years, not that much. Some of it was like a little bit, well, I'm done with that, and I don't really want to see what other people are doing with my toy. And but I would read some of it, and Mark Waid's run, stuck out to me. Really like Mark Waid as a writer and a person, um, and uh, and then at a convention, somebody had really recommended the Chip Zdarsky stuff,
Mhm.
so I'd read that even before this came up, and really enjoyed that a lot. I thought that was like, wow, this world feels good. This character
Yeah.
feels, good in these hands. So I was familiar with it and the vibe of it, and I reading that, I didn't feel disconnected from the world,
Mm.
and I also didn't feel like, oh my God, I could never play in this space. I
Yeah.
would not compare myself to his work and Mark's work. But you read some stuff and you feel like, oh my God, I can't play in that space. But I just liked it, and I said, yeah,
Yeah.
this is great. I wasn't being comparative. But Devin and Tom, the associate editor, in our first conversations, they were just really loose and kind of inviting. They just said, hey, like go wherever you want, play with some characters that you haven't played with before, think about some big threats, big villains. Who are some characters who he hasn't faced? maybe throw in a Kingpin scene, maybe throw in a Spider-Man scene. They just dished out like all of these good ingredients in a way. And it was like, so I didn't really know what that meant or what to do with those immediately. But that's a great space to be in,
Yeah.
just to have that kind of inviting sort of enthusiasm, I guess. And it was an August day. It was like this was the summer, not this past summer, but the summer before. And I remember sitting out on my back deck, and it was just all of a sudden, these loose ideas that they had kind of given. I just started to jot them down. Like, here's a line of dialogue. Here's what if he's here? What if there's kidnapped people? What if there's this? What if there's that? And and it just suddenly turned into an outline of a story. And I would say there's a good 70% of that is what you're reading now. Like in
Yeah.
just that one afternoon,
Mm.
not to say like I'm like amazing thing, but I think I was just in tune with the Daredevil universe enough that these signals kind of came in, and I wasn't feeling that I was competing with myself. Oh my
Right.
gosh, is this like in this space here? Or I wasn't feeling like I was competing with anybody who was currently writing it or going to be writing it. It was just a vibe of a fun story. And I ran it past these guys, and they were like, yeah, yeah, that's good. And their suggestions were, originally I had, some different details.
Yeah.
It wasn't, um, it was a little further afield than Hell's Kitchen. Devin was like, "No, bring it back to Hell's Kitchen," you which was smart. All the suggestions have been like really good. They've been very yes, I get that. That's right. Very nothing challenging of what really on it. The most challenging thing, honestly, was the title. I was not on board with the title. I'd come up with like about 15, 20 titles that I thought were going to be really cool, like against the law, sort of you're above the law, like Steven Seagal titles from the 90s. And they were like, no, the sales department wants to call it Black Armor. I was like, well, well, I guess that's that then, and but now that's the title, so I love it.
And I mean, I guess I didn't realize it until this time we're having this conversation now. You mentioned that you never referred to it as armor in the original
Yeah,
run. And so did Marvel kind of have this title of Black Armor? Like, has that been utilized when they like made the toy? Was it called Black Armor? Or like where did this kind of Black Armor idea come about? Do you know like the name?
I don't. I mean, I don't know if any of the toys. I mean, I have a couple of them on the shelf. I don't even think they call it Black Armor on the
Okay.
on the things, but I think it's just one of those things that people just sort of quote unquote naturally refer to it as.
Yeah.
And gets back to the when I was saying before, nobody except Scott really drew it well, because they would always make it armor. They would always bulk it up. They'd add bolts
Right.
to it. They'd act like it was, Iron Man Jr. or something. And so I think a lot of people just naturally referred to it that way because of the shoulder
Yeah.
elements and the tougher plating and those kind of things. But no, I never did. I would do interviews and people would say, "Oh, the armor." I'd say, "Well, I've never referred to it as armor, until Devin was like, nope, sales is going to call it Black Armor." I was like, all right, well then I'm calling it Black Armor,
Here we
but
go. It's Black Armor now.
we're off to the races. But you'll never I mean, Daredevil or Matt will never call it armor in the book.
Yeah.
But that's just me having fun with that. But obviously the book is called Black Armor. I mean, I guess he does a little bit toward the end, because it was interesting writing it. And I felt so this is a fun conversation, by the way. But
Good.
uh the like I felt very like free, as I said, in the way I kind of explored the ideas.
Yeah.
And I remember asking Devin early on, um, well, do you think the story is somehow about the armor, or does it just happen to have the armor in it? And he was his thing was, no, it's just a story about that has the armor in it,
Yeah.
which is the right beginning tone to take, I think, because we wanted to sort of I think established the idea that while the that costume appeared primarily in two and a half stories, maybe three stories, and then was sort of gone, except for some toys and maybe some DLC characters and some video games or something. Um, you know, to explore the idea that maybe a lot of other adventures took place with this costume, and nobody ever told them.
Mm,
But as I went into the story, it sort of did become about the armor in a way, not in a heavy-handed way. I didn't sit there and read Joseph Campbell things about armor and try to kind of inject some intellectual storytelling literary device into it.
right.
But invariably, I started to kind of find just moments that, well, yeah, what does the armor mean? What does it do in terms of protecting him and his identity and certain things, which in a very natural way I felt uh, made it come to life. Or I'm very pleased with how it weaves itself together and where it ultimately lands. I just turned in the last script last week, and got the beautiful email back of like, no notes, all good. So it was like, yeah, it was very nice. So
You get that when you get those no notes emails back, those guys are like, yes, it's
yeah, yes,
this.
yeah, yeah, it felt good. It felt really nice.
How many is it? Is it 4 or 5 issues?
It was originally five, and I wrote it to five, and then they came back and said, "Yeah, we can only do four." So I had to rewrite it and repaste it. But it's four, so
Okay.
so three comes out at the 24th of this month of January, and then the last one comes out on Valentine's Day. So yes,
A perfect way to spend your Valentine's Day is to read
exactly,
Daredevil.
exactly.
I'm like,
Do not get your loved one flowers or candy. Get them Daredevil Black Armor #4.
that's it.
Yep. I think that's right on.
And if you get in trouble with your significant other, just tell them Dan said you could do it.
I said it. I will. That's what I'm getting my wife. I'm getting her. Yes, I'm sure she'll really appreciate that.
So, oh, Dan, this has been a lot of fun talking with you. Is there anything that as we're wrapping up, that about your time in comics or stuff that you've worked on that we haven't gotten to hit on that you'd like to touch base with yet? Or
No, I mean, there's a ton of stuff you could talk about, but I mean,
yeah,
this has been a perfect zone to kind of,
yeah,
play out in, and appreciate you being interested in what was and what's going on right now. And if people like the conversation, check out this comic especially,
yep,
because as I said, we're really excited about it, and I think from what I can tell from the people who read it, they're jazzed about it. So I recommend people check it out for an alternate Daredevil, because there's a lot of Daredevil stuff out right
right,
now, which is pretty cool. It's a regular book. There's this gang war thing, and all of which I can now go read because I wasn't reading any other Daredevil stuff currently while I was scripting this because I didn't want to get influenced. So
right.
now I can go, now that I got no notes, I can go pick up the other stuff and see what the hell's going on.
So you're able to actually get to experience the Daredevil stuff that's coming in now as just as a fan then, because you're like,
Yeah, yeah, right. Yeah, because I don't know. I know like this much of what's going in the regular book just from whatever,
yep,
seeing a preview or some news article, but I haven't read any of it, and so that will be kind of an interesting counterpoint to the epic lunacy that we're doing in this Black Armor thing, which just keeps getting more and more exhausting as the story goes on.
well, I do appreciate though that I feel like Marvel and DC have both been doing this a little bit more of allowing their characters, different versions of their characters, to exist in comics in their own way. Like
Yeah,
you have your current Daredevil run, you have this Daredevil Black Armor, and it doesn't take away from what the other one's doing. And I think that's a good space to be in comics.
it is an interesting space, and it's a great observation, because it does allow, I think, people a chance to kind of appreciate the character in different
Mhm.
ways without it having to be, oh, it's another continuity jump,
Right,
right? Here's another story, but it's like it's tied into these other 15 stories where it's, as I've said, I, I don't think a complete newbie could pick up Black Armor. You probably have to appreciate superheroes to some degree to kind of buy into the conceit of a guy running around in a Black Armor costume in Hell's Kitchen. But I think that it has a very nice self-contained range and a self-contained energy. Um, and that's what readers, of characters are probably like. Why wouldn't you like the regular Green Lantern and maybe this Green Lantern story, that's a little self-contained and maybe has a different vibe or a different
Mhm.
art style or so forth. I think that's a very I would love to see them both publishers, any publisher, explore
Yeah.
that more.
Yeah. Yeah, I would. I definitely would. So, well, Dan, where can people follow along with you of what you're working on, what you're creating, just so they can stay up to
Um,
date?
yeah, they can find me as DG Chichester at on Twitter. I refuse to call it X,
Same.
and Instagram are places I have a public face on, and then I have a newsletter which I'm almost embarrassed to recommend because I haven't updated it in so long. But I have every intention of doing it this week, which is at storymaze.substack.com. So any combination thereof is a good place to check me out.
Nice. I'm glad that you just voiced that you still call it Twitter, because I still, in all my descriptions of my interviews, I have where you can find the creators, and I've never changed it from Twitter to X. I'm just like, no, it's still
I'm
Twitter.
just nah. It's like,
It's
well,
still
when you
Twitter.
the fact that it's such a screwed up like enterprise. If I can still type twitter.com and it goes there, then it's Twitter, right?
Yep.
If you really want to force people, which I don't put it past them, just change it to X, but it just shows that you don't really. So as long
I
as
don't
that
think I've ever
works,
heard anyone call it out there in the ethos
no,
actually
no.
refer to it as
I
X.
think people who work in journalism and social media circles, probably have to, with a straight face say to their clients, well, we
Right.
recommend X, as a platform for whatever lunacy is going on there. So
Absolutely. So, well, again, Dan, thank you so much for taking some time to talk about comics.
my
Gang,
pleasure. Yeah.
if you are watching this or listening to this on the podcast, make sure you go check out Daredevil Black Armor. It's a lot of fun, and dig your toe, dip your toe into all the other stuff that Dan has worked on. That we just grazed this topic, like
Oh yeah.
we didn't even talk about anything else, like in of from your runs at Marvel, and we could, and I'll have to bring you on and do that again at some point.
Oh,
So,
I'd love to. Yeah. I mean, you could spend a whole half an hour talking about Nick Fury or Hellraiser or a bunch of other cool stuff, but this is a perfectly great topic. So thank you for
yeah,
the chance to
absolutely.
come on.
So, with that being said, gang, go check out Dan's work, and hopefully you can find some time to curl up, grab a book, and nerd out. Peace.